Fallujah pressed heat into the ground until it felt like it could bend metal. First, Lieutenant Emily Hart lay motionless in a ghillie suit, chest rising and slow. Trained breaths. The Mk-12 SPR rested on a steady bipod. Stock settled. Rear bag snug in her hand. Through the AN PVS 30 clip-on, the city shimmered in a flat, silvery wash. She tasted grit on her teeth, felt a light wind at 3 to 5 knots, and nudged a 0. 3 mil left hold. Sectors fell into a calm scan, near to far. Left to right, back to near. She keyed her mic and reported as phantom actual, holding overwatch. Voice even and unhurried. Nothing about the moment asked for drama, only discipline. Hours later, she stepped off the ridge and moved by route back to the forward operating base. Diesel swam in the air, canvas snapped, and a rotor hum faded somewhere past the wire. The recreation area buzzed while a few soldiers threw glances at the numbers on her neck and let their smirks do the talking. Emily kept moving, checked gear by habit, and gave the noise nothing to push against. Inside the operations aisle, she paused just long enough to listen to the radios breathe. A crisp crackle rose and fell, a reminder that the night was not finished with them. The numbers at her collar were not decoration, not a dare. They were a memory and a warning, and they would matter before the sun came up again. Dust lifted in thin sheets as First Lieutenant Emily Hart stepped through the wire and into the forward operating base. The recreation area hummed with cards, low music, and easy laughter. A few soldiers glanced at the numbers on her neck and let a joke pass between them without saying much. She kept her pace even, eyes forward, breathing steady like she was still on the gun. Inside the operations aisle, the air smelled like diesel and canvas. Fluorescent light flattened every edge while she ran quiet PCCs and PCIs by touch. Bolt forward, chamber check. Magazine seated, comms fill verified, NVG focus set, IR strobe secured, sling adjusted. She logged her sector scans on a clipboard and wiped grit from the back of her hand. Commander Jason Whitaker looked over her performance data, gave a neutral nod that said the work was clean, then moved on. Sergeant First Class Cole Ramirez brushed her shoulder as he passed. Nothing hard enough to start a problem. Just a test she refused to take. Emily let it fall behind her the way she let heat waves roll off a scope. She paused near the exit, hand hovering for a second, and did not touch the tattoo. The hallway speakers carried a faint hiss from the radios. She stood still until the noise settled, then started walking again. The numbers at her collar stayed hidden under fabric and salt and dust. They belonged to her and to what came next, and she would answer with competence, not noise. Coffee steamed in paper cups while dust hung in the glow of fluorescent tubes at 6:30 a.m. The operations tent felt cramped with maps, laptops, and a big screen washed with satellite imagery. First Lieutenant Emily Hart stood with a notebook, quiet among the shuffle of gear and chairs. The air carried diesel from the generators and the sweet burn of instant coffee. Commander Jason Whitaker, Naval Special Warfare, 05, laid out the mission based on Colonel Alan Mercer's plan. 3 American aid workers were believed to be inside a walled compound on the eastern edge of the city. A mixed SEAL assault element would take the lead with Ranger support, and Emily would serve as overwatch, OIC. She studied the terrain models and the roof lines, weighing angles and fields of fire. Emily recommended the East Ridge for cleaner sight lines and better exfil routes along covered alleys. Whitaker held to Colonel Mercer's recon plan and kept the original ridge. His tone measured and final. The room accepted the decision, and the clatter of chairs returned as teams prepped gear. Emily marked sectors on her pad and logged ranges she could cover despite the less favorable angle. As bodies flowed toward the exits, Sergeant First Class Cole Ramirez slid by with a small shoulder brush that she let pass. She moved to a side table, confirmed the comms fill, and checked call signs while the radio net murmured. She folded the map overlay, traced her fire lanes, and packed it with her kit. In the corner of the satellite image, a set of coordinates sat only a few hundred meters from the numbers at her collar, and she closed the folder without touching her neck. The night held no moon and little comfort. First Lieutenant Emily Hart settled prone behind her Mach 12 SPR. Bipods sunk into gritty soil, and PVS-30 clipped in place over glass that showed the city in shades of pale. She let her breathing drop into a slow cadence and listened to the hush between distant dogs and the faint thrum of generators beyond the wire. Below, the mixed SEAL and Ranger element eased forward, their IR strobes winking like soft stars through her optic. She worked her sectors with a steady rhythm, near to far, left to right, back to near. The northeast building ranged at roughly 430 meters. A light wind brushed her cheek at 3 to 5 knots. She dialed a quiet 0. 3 mil left hold and waited for the scope to settle. A pinprick of glass flash blinked in a second-story window that had not been on the recon imagery. Emily keyed the net and reported as Phantom Actual, possible movement northeast second-story window. The reply came crisp from Commander Jason Whitaker that the structure was marked abandoned and to proceed as planned. She held fire, logged the sightline in her notes, and let the crosshairs drift back to the gate. She checked wind again and confirmed her hold, then watched the strobes with a small knot in her gut. If the enemy had NVG, those friendly beacons could cut both ways. Procedure said maintain discipline, so she did. No shots. No heroics. Only a quiet press of instinct against the book as the breach drew near. The breach charge punched the compound gate, and the mixed SEAL assault element flowed inside with Ranger support. First Lieutenant Emily Hart lay on her assigned ridge. MK-12 SPR settled on a steady bipod, and PVS-30 clipped on the glass. She kept her cheek weld quiet and her breathing, even while the optic washed the scene in pale grain. 2 heartbeats after entry, the rhythm shifted from rehearsed to real. Fire ripped in from flanking rooftops and alleys, and an RPG cracked near the courtyard center. Emily snapped to her nearest threat and sent controlled pairs, then shifted to the next muzzle flash. She used clean callouts with simple anchors like gate at 2 o'clock window and adjusted for the light wind with a 0. 3 mil left hold. Range to the northeast building sat near 400 meters, and she kept her dope steady while prioritizing the shooters with elevation. Radio traffic started fine, and then broke into static as Commander Jason Whitaker and the ground element reported heavy contact from the north and the east. Emily rode the glass through dust and sparks, bought seconds where she could, and watched the pressure keep building. A second RPG shook the compound, and the TOC fell away as the net thinned to fragments and then silence, with Whitaker cutting in for a moment before his words died mid-sentence. The shape of the fight said the intel was wrong and the book plan was slipping. She reset her hold. Comms thinned to a hiss, and the assault element stayed pinned in place. First Lieutenant Emily Hart understood the ridge had given all it could. She slid the MK-12 SPR into a drag bag, cinched the zipper, tightened her sling, then seated the weight across her back. NVG went on. Diopter set. And she gave the net a brief transmission that Phantom was moving even if no one could hear it. She dropped from the skyline and rode shadow lines, letting distance and darkness do most of the work. Stop. Look. Listen. Smell. Then move again. Each pause long enough to read the ground and the air. Footfalls were placed heel to toe, soft and sure, until the outer wall rose in front of her like a darker piece of night. 3 shapes held the perimeter, and she used suppressed single shots, one at a time. Clean backstops, no spill, and the lane opened. A rifle lay near a fallen fighter, and she recovered the M4A1 for close work. Quick press check. Selector, on semi. Sling adjusted for a tight carry. White light kept off, except for a brief momentary pulse to clear a blind corner. She checked her breathing and listened to the fight inside the compound, marking the rhythm like a metronome. The job had shifted from sniper overwatch to direct action, and there was no room for bravado. only light and noise discipline and the next quiet step toward her team. First Lieutenant Emily Hart slipped through the breach and into tight hallways that stank of dust and cordite. The Mk-12 stayed secured while the M4A1 rode high across her chest, ready for close rooms. She sliced each corner with slow arcs, muzzle steady, white light off, except for brief checks that flashed and died. Short controlled bursts on semi cleared 2 threats at close range, and the corridor went still. A SEAL dragged an arm and stalled in the open. She hooked his vest, pulled him behind a doorway, and cinched a tourniquet high and tight. She pressed the net with a low, friendly moving call and moved toward the courtyard. There she found Commander Jason Whitaker and Sergeant First Class Cole Ramirez pinned behind a shattered wall with 2 bodies cooling in the dust. Emily pointed to a rusted hatch hidden by debris and mouthed that it led to cellars and culverts not on their map. When she leaned forward, her collar lifted and the edge of the coordinates showed, enough to explain why she knew the route. A clink-tapped stone and a grenade rolled near Ramirez. She barked a sharp frag call, hauled him clear, wrapped him, and took shrapnel across her back. The blast punched the wall and filled air with grit. She checked her lungs, ran the rifle, and spoke steady on the net that they were moving. No drama, only the next task and the route downward. The room narrowed to breath, heartbeat, and the work that soldiers do. The stairwell dumped them into cool air and concrete that smelled like damp earth and old oil. First Lieutenant Emily Hart held up a fist, then opened 2 fingers, and the line adjusted to 2-man spacing without a word. Light stayed low, lamps shielded by palms, white beams used only as quick flashes to clear corners. Commander Jason Whitaker guided the element forward with Sergeant First Class Cole Ramirez, while Emily paused at a junction where 3 passages met. She read the angles and chose the narrowest corridor as her hold. The space made a natural choke point with hard backstops and tight acoustics. She pulled the mag, counted what felt like 12 left, pressed it back in, and settled into a rhythm that matched her breathing. Short shoot and move bursts snapped and echoed, the sound bouncing like extra rifles down the stone. Footsteps grew louder and then hesitated, fooled by the echoes. Her bolt locked to the rear and the lane went quiet for half a beat. She drew the M9, indexed the front sight, and sent 2 fast shots that flattened the lead shapes. The slide locked open and a 3rd fighter lunged, so she met him with a fixed blade fighting knife. A short close fight that ended in stillness and a hard breath. Behind her, the pursuit faded as the element moved toward daylight and the extraction point. Emily leaned on the wall until the ringing left her ears. She listened for Whitaker and Ramirez up ahead and heard the soft scrape of their boots. A faint shaft of light painted a line on the floor, and she started limping toward it with her rifle slung tight and her mind on the next turn. First light washed the old marketplace in a pale band as a UH-60 Black Hawk dropped into a dusty HLZ. The element snapped a clean 360, muzzles out, knees bent, eyes cutting the alleys. Commander Jason Whitaker gave a tight LZ brief that covered wind, wires, and debris, while medics hustled litters, clipped straps, and checked airways. Sergeant First Class Cole Ramirez stood bandaged near the perimeter and watched the tunnel mouth with a hard, steady scan. Heat rose with the rotor wash and turned the dust into a curtain. A figure pushed through the haze and came into view with a limp and a torn uniform. First Lieutenant Emily Hart climbed aboard without drama, blood soaking the back of her blouse, gear still locked down. The medic slid her onto a bench, checked for shrapnel along the spine line, and pulled a pressure dressing while the crew chief signaled ready. Inside the cabin, Whitaker braced a tablet on his knee and skimmed a preliminary BDA from ISR and witness reports. The summary read 17 assessed Kia, with a correction that the route below was connected ratlines and cellars rather than formal tunnels. The team settled into a quiet that was not exhaustion but understanding as eyes fell to the faint numbers at the base of Emily's neck. Respect moved through the cabin without a word. The Black Hawk lifted, and the city fell away in brown and gray squares. Emily sat elbows on knees, breathing even, gaze fixed past the open door. The team looked out at the fading skyline and let the noise of the rotors carry what they did not say. Procedure held, relief followed, and the mission finally exhaled. At 0900 hours, the formation yard at FOB Falcon held a clean line of uniforms and straight backs. Flags moved in a light breeze and boots shifted softly on gravel while the guidon stood fixed. The sun sat low and bright, washing the ranks in a hard gold that made every crease and patch stand out. First Lieutenant Emily Hart stood at attention in the front, eyes forward and still. Commander Jason Whitaker, Naval Special Warfare, 05, stepped to the podium and addressed the formation with precise, measured words. He stated that First Lieutenant Emily Hart was recommended for the Silver Star for extraordinary valor in combat, and he read the citation language with care. No excess, no flourish, only the facts of a fight and the standard of duty that mattered. The yard listened, and the wind carried the sound across the HESCO. When the remarks ended, Sergeant First Class Cole Ramirez stepped from the ranks and faced her with the quiet focus of a soldier who had learned something the hard way. He acknowledged that he had misjudged her and that she had saved the team. Emily answered with calm professionalism that she had done her job and gave him a small nod that closed the distance without calling attention to it. Courtesies were correct, and the moment stayed clean. Whitaker returned to his place and gave a quiet nod that felt like a final stamp. The formation held steady, and the yard eased from tension into respect. Doubt thinned and left room for something better to stand in its place. The morning moved on, the breeze still light, and the sound of gravel under boots faded as the ranks were dismissed. 6 months later, the heat at Fort Benning sat heavy over the sniper range and turned the air into a slow wave. Rows of trainees lay in prone with faces pressed behind glass, sweat tracing lines across dust. First Lieutenant Emily Hart moved down the line with a steady pace and a quiet way, adjusting elbows, settling sling tension, and nudging bipods into honest ground. She checked natural point of aim, coached breathing cycles, and kept every correction simple and calm. She paused beside a young shooter and watched the reticle wander with each breath. Her hand tapped the stock, and she talked him through the pause, the press, and the follow-through without lifting the muzzle off target. When the line called safe, she took a rifle of her own and slid into a clean prone on the mat. Stock weld locked in, rear bag pinched, and her breathing fell into a soft valley that felt familiar. The shot broke like a small click, and the steel far downrange rang clean. She lifted off the gun and let the class hear the echo fade across the berms. Sunlight caught the edge of her collar, and the faint coordinates flashed for a second. Small and sharp, a hint of weight behind the lesson. She spoke about skill as a form of respect for the team and the mission, not as a trophy, but as a duty that keeps people alive. The line reset, and the students went back to work. Emily walked the berm again and watched groups tighten by a half-inch at a time. There was no bravado in the heat, only patience and process. The range held its rhythm, and her voice carried just far enough to steady the next trigger press. Sunset draped the motor pool in soft orange as First Lieutenant Emily Hart stood in profile near the edge of the lot. The bass noise thinned to a distant hum of generators and a faint chop from a bird miles out. She waited a moment before shouldering her ruck, then turned toward the barracks with an easy, measured pace. The light caught the back of her neck, and the coordinates showed for a heartbeat, thin and pale against skin that had learned to heal. Inside, she packed for reassignment with the same order she used on a firing line. Socks rolled tight, notebooks squared, rifle case latched. Everything checked once and then again. On the walk to supply, she passed soldiers who had once doubted her, and they gave small nods that said more than words. A breeze came down the lane and lifted the edge of her collar, so the numbers flickered and settled like they belonged exactly where they were. She did not think of victory or legend. She thought about work done right and people who made it home because someone stayed steady when it mattered. Scars are reminders, not decorations. And they point us to who we choose to be when the light gets thin. If you have a moment when someone underestimated you and you kept moving anyway, share it below so someone else can find their footing. If this story stayed with you, like, share, and subscribe to ride with us into the next chapter when the mission calls again.